ICU.
Hello, welcome to ICU. I'm Melanie Price, and I'll be guest hosting for a few weeks while Eddie Robinson is on parental leave. Today we'll be talking about how and what the spaces we inhabit teach us about race. Houston is one of the largest cities in the country and certainly one of the most diverse. But cities are also divided based on a host of characteristics. We choose where we want to live based on the cost of housing, the style of houses, and proximity to work. But for much of our history, there was one factor that didn't allow us to make these choices: race. Deed restrictions, lending practices known as redlining, and other measures created the racially segregated cities we see across America. We discuss this and more today with two Houston natives. Assata Richards is the director of the Sankofa Research Institute, and Juliet Stepech is an attorney and former director of the Mayor's Office of Education. Hello, I'm Melanie Price, filling in for Eddie Robinson while he's on parental leave. You're listening to ICU on Houston Public Media. Today, we're going to be talking about what urban spaces can teach us about race. Joining me today is Assata Richards and Juliet Stepech. The thing I'm really interested in talking to them about is that they are adults who live in the community that they grew up in. And so before we talk about how you live in those communities as adults, I'd like to spend some time talking about the neighborhoods of your childhood. What were the racial markers for you? How did you know that you were in a particular kind of community? How did it reflect your own cultural heritage? I'm going to start with you, Juliet.
So I grew up in the East End in a neighborhood called Pecan Park. And at the time I grew up, there were a lot of elderly folks in the neighborhood that had lived there for quite some time, working in the different manufacturing industries. But my parents were some of the first Latinos that moved into the neighborhood. And as I grew, there was a massive wave of immigration that came from Mexico and Central America. In particular, during the horrible civil war in El Salvador and areas in Central America, we had a huge wave of newcomers that moved into the neighborhood. And I just remember the dramatic transformation. I remember when the first fiesta in Houston opened up on Wayside, and my parents said there's a neighborhood where we can finally get avocados and different types of peppers and things along those lines. It was unique to find cilantro. I mean, it was just, and so I always felt like, and I tell folks, even though I grew up in the United States and I was born, my sister and I were born in the United States, I felt like I grew up living foreign in America. I didn't realize that white people could be Catholics too. I thought all Catholics were Latinos. I did, we lived in a community that was so kind of isolated. We lived in our street. We played with the neighbors. I grew up with a lot of spending time, drinking coffee and watching Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy with elderly persons. But I think the thing is, it's like the East End was always so special because of that great diversity that we saw. And also the conversations that were had about the struggles that people lived and what brought them to America.
Here's the thing that I always think is so interesting talking to Juliet, and I think it's going to resonate with you, Assata. So the same grocery store she's referring to is the grocery store of my childhood, too.
Mine.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we're African Americans, and we're excited that they put a grocery store not that far from us, right? Mm-hmm. And it has all the things that, even though you're Black in Texas, I mean, there are all these things that are Latino that you still... I didn't know until I left Texas that enchiladas were not like a regular part of the soul food diet. Yeah. So you don't know these things until you leave here, and people are like, "What?" And so it's always so interesting to me how our neighborhoods are right next to each other,
yes.
Right? And some of the things that we take advantage of are the exact same thing, only we're coming at it from a different side of the you're coming from the north, we're coming from the south, or something like that. So Assata, you are a third generation resident of Third Ward. Mm-hmm. Tell us about your childhood growing up there and what were some of the racial signifiers for you?
I think it was a look, the sound, and the feel of the neighborhood. So a neighborhood like Third Ward, one of the things, if you grew up in Third Ward, was the TSU marching band. You could hear them practicing daily in the neighborhood, right? You could mark your time by the sound of the band. It was also people riding their bikes, and we call them tricked out bikes. They may have a radio on there. It was really the feel of creativity. It was Shape Community Center. It was Texas Southern, the homecoming parade. It was Jack Yates and their competition with Wheatley High School. And so it really was the sounds and the feel. My grandparents lived in CUNY Homes, and even though they eventually moved to South Park, we came back to CUNY Homes every Saturday. My cousins lived in CUNY Homes. It was a YMCA that had the best Christmas party and gave the neighborhood kids gifts. It was really just this feeling, and you could feel the difference in the way it looked. And I think it had a buzz and a vibrancy. People live in the neighborhood versus another neighborhood where people live in their houses. But in a place like Third Ward, you live in the neighborhood. You cook out, you hang out. And so it was this feeling of really, it had a vibration that was very different. And I love this story about Fiesta because we never thought of Fiesta as a place for Latinos. Until she said it, I just was like,
I was like, no, that was our Fiesta.
That was our Fiesta. We had the one on McCowan. We went almost every day to that Fiesta. My grandmother loved that Fiesta. You saw your neighbors at that store, right? And I think that's another thing about, I say my neighborhood, it had a small enough footprint that you could interact with people. Going to the post office was you saw people you knew at the post office. Mm-hmm. So it was the way in which we lived our lives out loud that really came in contact with other people. And I always felt lonely when I was in other neighborhoods. I felt a sense of loneliness.
So Juliet, obviously you had to know when you were past the boundaries of your community. Boundaries overlap in what we consider community, and common spaces can be interpreted differently, right? What were the things that signaled you're no longer here? You're no longer home?
We rarely left home. That's another thing. We were always, we'd stay in the neighborhood. And so anytime we left the neighborhood, it was to go to the airport potentially to see family off back to Argentina. It was always like, we're leaving. Mm-hmm. We're going to be gone for a while. I would take my stuffed animals and put them in the car because I wanted to make sure we were going to be safe. And I wasn't sure when we were coming back home. And, I just knew that when we went to a different grocery store called Gemco, which was different from Fiesta, it was like we were going to the other grocery store. And so it always felt like it was something that was so foreign and different and leaving the neighborhood. It's like, I also remember once when we were going to Louisiana and passing through a town called Orange, my dad was like, the car cannot stop
here. Right?
Yeah. And so I just always knew that, my family was like, once we leave our neighborhood, it kind of felt like you were out of your bubble, out of your safety net. Mm-hmm. You had to carry yourself in a different way too.
I think that's so interesting because we oftentimes, if you think about research, people talk about train tracks or particular streets or things like that. And one of the things that's so interesting about Houston is the ways in which the same street changes names.
Yes.
Depending on where you are.
Yes.
And as the name changes, so does the racial composition of the community change.
And the trees. And the green space. And the appearance of the parks. And all the things that are available. Even today, it's like I sometimes think when you drive down Memorial, you leave Telephone Road, you go from one area community culture to another. And those things, we remember them as children, and they continue to be perpetuated today.
Yeah. And I think the landscape, the scale of things, I think more affluent neighborhood, there's more personal space and individualized space, right? Mm-hmm. We did leave the neighborhood a lot. My grandmother was a domestic servant in Memorial City and in River Oaks. So we did a lot of going back and forth. And I can really say we didn't see that neighborhood was better. It looked differently. And the things that you could access were different, and I could sense the shift in my grandparents. I could sense the shift in their personal feeling of safety and security, that they were in a place where, and my grandfather would say, Muhammad Ali tried to buy a house in River Oaks. My grandfather would say, so my family very much talked about the differences and things that were happening politically and how fortunate we were. Because we felt fortunate to live in this neighborhood. It was a banner. To be from JY, to have family members that were JY, Jack Yates alumni, right? Like going back, we felt a sense of pride about our neighborhood. And so I never felt my neighborhood was inferior because my neighborhood had these giants of human beings and places that figured so strongly in my life. So I knew it was different, but it was a difference. It wasn't a deficit. And I think that's the challenge, the lack of ability to see the value in communities across neighborhoods because the people who occupy them have intrinsic value. And I think that's what we're struggling with, and that's why we think we need to remake a neighborhood.
I'm Melanie Price. This is ICU. We're speaking with scholar and community organizer Assata Richards. We're also joined by lawyer and education advocate Juliet Stepech. It's so interesting. One of the things that you're both talking about is the way the adults in your life also signal to you that it wasn't just that you were in a different neighborhood. They signal to you that this is a neighborhood where things are different for you, right? This is a neighborhood where you're not as free as you were in your own neighborhood.
And not as protected. Things could happen that was beyond our control.
And I often wonder, is that something that non-minority, non-people of color feel moving through neighborhoods? That's not the feeling of safety because of crime. Right. Because oftentimes what we're talking about is moving into communities that have less crime or have better crime statistics than the ones we came from. But you still use the term, both of you have used the term safety as a way of describing what it's like. And that's the part that's so interesting because you couldn't convince the people in those communities that they aren't in the safest places possible.
Right. And the thing is, it's like the safety is being yourself.
That's right.
Being yourself, being authentic. You could go and you could walk around barefoot, fighting with your neighbors and riding bikes like crazy, staying out till 10 o'clock. It was just, you felt safe with your community, your culture, your identity. And then when you left the neighborhood, it's like growing up. I remember my parents were learning how to speak English. My father was just very adamant. You have to speak English. He didn't want people to treat us differently. And I know that he just got treated so horribly because he could speak English. We spoke English with a very strong accent. And he was just so terrified that we were going to get discriminated against. And so, I think about those things. My father is like my personal hero. And my mother, just a absolute, beautiful, caring, wonderful woman. But my mother was learning how to speak English. She knew less English than my father when I was a child. So not only was it that we were afraid of, getting out of our comfort zone, they'd go to stores and they wouldn't be able to communicate with people. And so, there were stories that they told me of their treatment in other places and spaces. And so that was something that was very difficult for me to see as a child as well, for your parents to be disrespected because of language barriers.
Yeah. So because we went to high school together, I should say that about Juliet. I know you were bused across the city.
Yes.
Right. And for me, that was a profound learning experience about what cities can offer, about how different neighborhoods are, about how neighborhood can shape your future regardless of talent or merit. And so, like you, I didn't spend a lot of time outside of my neighborhood until I started riding a school bus in the 6th grade. And then you have the opportunity, because you're leaving your community to go to school, you have an opportunity to go through all of these neighborhoods because you have to stop a lot. Yeah. And you see inside people's homes and you see all of these things and you start to learn very early on about major differences between your neighborhood and other neighborhoods. Did you have an experience like that riding the bus, and what was it like for you?
Very much so. I mean, it was like we didn't spend much time out of the neighborhood, and my sister was first accepted into the high school for performing and visual art.
Mm-hmm.
And just being able to be the little sister 2.5 years younger and go and see this campus with this checkered floor and fame and people singing and dancing and but the thing was just being able to see this other neighborhood, the beautiful houses and the old oak trees and the large driveway. I mean, just it was very just eye-opening. And then taking the ride from the East End to law enforcement and seeing Memorial Drive and River Oaks and St. Thomas High School, it was just very transformative in terms of being able to see these other spaces. But then also along the ride, we'd pass through Third Ward and we'd pass by Ryan Middle School. And we'd have an opportunity. I remember the school having lines and lines of buses and then passing through U of H and being able to see this huge college campus. And also, you could see downtown from afar, but when these opportunities, when you're actually closer to the space, it was a unique opportunity to be able to see on a regular basis at the early part of the day and the latter part of the day what these other communities were experiencing as well.
So, Assata, when you got the opportunity, though, you can live anywhere you want in Houston. You decided to stay.
Yeah, I decided to
say
come
more
back,
about why it was so important to you to live in this community.
It was this group of people and this place that, one, had instilled in me that I was amazing, I was great, I was fantastic, I was capable, I was resilient, and that I could go to Penn State, to the mountains of Penn State, and face all of my fears and get this PhD, and that was possible, and it was also necessary. So it was because I came from such a strong community that supported me. And I think for me, place is about being fully seen and valued. And that's what Third Ward always did for me.
And so that's why you wanted to come back to it?
That's why I needed to. It wasn't even a desire. I was not going to survive. I was not going to bring the best out of myself in a place where I could not fully be myself. And in graduate school, that's what you have to do. And so I came back because I needed Third Ward. Third Ward didn't need me. Third Ward is a place and it has lots of assets, but I needed Third Ward. And that's why I came back, because I needed a place to hold me and protect me and sustain me for my
Juliet,
life.
is that why you stayed too? Is that why you were...
Assata just hit the nail on the head. The community that nurtures, supports, loves you, where you feel comfortable and authentic, it builds confidence, it gives you strength, it gives you hope. It's a place of opportunity. That's what I love about the East End. And that's why I stayed in the East End. I also wanted to be close to my parents. I wanted to be able to say, yeah, I've been to Rice and UT and this and that. And I looked at different places around the city when I was looking for a home. And then I said, home is, it's where your heart is. It's where you know the folks and the places and the spaces. And I wanted to be back in the East End.
When we come back, cities around the country have taken down Confederate statues in an attempt to erase the history that they represent. But how does this affect the people that live in the community? More with Assata Richards and Juliet Stepech when we return. Welcome to ICU. I'm Melanie Price, filling in for Eddie Robinson. Many of us never grew up with whites-only signs and laws that required schools to be racially segregated, but the city landscape still has much to tell us about where groups belong and where they are out of place. Today, we're going to be talking about what urban spaces teach us about race. Joining me today are Texas natives Asada Richards and Juliet Stepech. Asada is a scholar and community organizer, and Juliet is a lawyer and education advocate. Welcome, Juliet and Asada. What are some of the buildings and spaces in this city to you that you think are important racial markers? Like, what are the places where you say, this place in Houston is super important to the Latinos that I know, or this space in Houston is super important to me and my African-American family? Are there some spaces like that that you can think of?
Right off the bat, in the East End, there's a gazebo that the community calls El Kiosco. And it was designed and developed, I can't even remember if it was in the 30s or 40s, but it was one of the first Mexican-American designed architectural pieces that has been a continual center where quinceañeras, birthday parties, everything would take place. And, that's something that's a source of pride. And it's one it's a gazebo, doesn't necessarily say, or commemorate a particular person, but the neighborhood all knows that it's a commemoration of our culture and community.
Right. It's marked by the way that people use it to help you understand these moments. Anything come up for you, Asada, as you're thinking?
Yeah, I'd say the Jack Yates, the Wheatley, the Worthy high schools, right? I think schools factor very heavily in the African-American landscape and also in our experiences. So where we went to school are really critical, important places and then places of worship.
Right.
So I think throughout neighborhoods, like I would say, Hiram Clark is a power center. Those places where I think people gather are really marked spaces are really important to African-Americans. But I think that's a very important question because I don't think we have a sense of what's important to people in neighborhoods. I'm working in the historic Fifth Ward with a project called Memory Builds the Monument around Club Matinee. And so Club Matinee is no longer there, but the memories build the monument. And so because the physical structures are no longer there, but there are structures there. And really asking community this question: what are the valuable places in this neighborhood that really mean something to you? And I would also say the parks. McGregor Park, Emancipation Park, those parks and avenues, Lyons Avenue, MLK, of course, Emancipation, formerly Dowling, who was a Confederate officer. And the reason why that was changed, not was because he was, but for another reason. But it was important to note that these avenues and these statues were placed here as a form of intimidation. And they were marking place and territory for other people to know. And so I think we do have to address that. So changing and shifting that, because the intention was to intimidate and mark place, then we should have some intentionality about creating safety, security, and inclusivity by changing and removing these statues.
That's the thing that's always so interesting about this. People always ask me how I feel about these Confederate statues, and I tell them, well, not even a statue. I was born in Jefferson Davis Hospital. And nearly every one of my African-American and Latino friends I know who were born in a public hospital were born in Jefferson Davis Hospital, who are my age. And so basically, I was born in a hospital named after the first Confederate president. And all the Black kids that I know were born in that hospital, right? And it's like, how then do you match up what these things are named after with what the purpose becomes? Even though most of these people, it's not like we were paying attention to most of those statues. It's not like people were walking by thinking, what is that statue? And so I'm always interested in sort of what people take from those kinds of things. Juliet, what were you getting ready to say?
Well, I was just going to say, as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about, what other statues commemorate Latinos in the Houston area too, right? So I'm sitting there scratching my head, and I'm like, okay, the Kiosco, but what else, right? I know that there's a building in downtown that kind of has an Aztec motif that I was very proud of to see as a child. I'm like, look, the Aztec pyramid. Other structures and places, so I'm like, where else? And so like Asada, what you were saying, instead of an actual monument, you become more, you have beloved spaces and parks and places. And then you also think of the names of schools, like De Zavala Elementary. I asked folks, who is De Zavala? Most people tell me, I have no idea who De Zavala is. And, that was the vice president of the Republic of Texas, who was one of the lawyers that was extraordinarily scholarly that helped Texas in the Texas Revolution, right? I think he's buried in the battlegrounds of San Jacinto over you know, in that area. But no one knows the history because they don't necessarily teach it in the schools, right? And so if you go to the Capitol today, there's the De Zavala State Archives right next to the Capitol. And once again, it's named after the same person, but no one really knows who it is.
And I think, Juliet, you make an excellent point. That's why our neighborhoods matter so much to us. Because it's as if we don't matter outside of our neighborhood, right?
Right.
That's why the place we live and the culture and the landscape matter. Because when we go other places, it's as if we're invisible to a city. Our contributions are unnoted, unrecognized. And so I think that's why, you know, I fight so hard to protect communities and protect places, because I know that's where we do matter in ways that we don't matter outside of our neighborhoods, where other people get to name things and their history, their culture is acknowledged in the naming and the placing.
Well, Asada, it's interesting. When I was in the mayor's office, we'd have interns every summer. And so as a part of Mayor's Office of Education, I always wanted them to have an understanding of our neighborhoods and communities. And I told them that it was critical for them, if you were going to serve the city, to be able to recognize the unique culture, history, and footprints of all these different neighborhoods. But I would also tell them, it's like, let's do the tour of what was. Right next to City Hall's annex is, I guess it's called the historic, I can't even remember the name of the little neighborhood that's the park next to.
with the houses.
With the houses.
Okay.
And I
neighborhood, yes.
And I told folks, that is the center where neighborhoods, that's like the cemetery of neighborhoods, right? That's where neighborhoods, the buildings that you see in there are remnants of neighborhoods past. And I was like, there shouldn't be a cemetery for neighborhoods like that. And I know that that's not the intention for this, but in my opinion, I think that's very unique to Houston, to take beautiful homes from historic Houstonians and place it in a neighborhood cemetery. But near downtown, there was a community called Frostwood. And I believe like when the city first started, it was like a German immigrant community, and then it became part of Second Ward. It was actually called the Barrio de Alacran. And when 59 was built, the entire neighborhood was destroyed, which is another, we know many communities
That's
have
how
been
we mark a neighborhood, by that freeway.
By that freeway, right? And then I'd take folks to that historic marker and they would see, and I would tell them, if we don't save neighborhoods, you've got the cemetery next to downtown, but you also have the historic marker of Frostwood, Barrio de Alacran, of where a neighborhood was and no longer exists. So let's work hard to make sure that we preserve, recognize, celebrate our communities and our culture and our history, because we don't want to create. Houston shouldn't be an instant city. It's never been an instant city. This city has had so many cultures and people and communities that make it great. But when you destroy and remove a neighborhood, you remove the history, and people don't know the contribution. And that causes so much pain and a terrible way of moving forward together.
I'm Melanie Price. This is ICU. We're speaking with scholar and community organizer Asada Richards. We're also joined by lawyer and education advocate Juliet Stepech. I want to talk a little bit about what you think can go in its place. That is, what kinds of ways should we be commemorating neighborhoods? What kinds of things do you think we should be doing to maintain neighborhoods?
I think we need to communicate and appreciate and always have the input of the folks currently in the community to be able to move forward in a vision and a strategy that's inclusive. I think you have to have a great school available and to be able to empower the community. But I think it just always has to be, if you have to know the history of a community in order to be able to build a better future. Without that, you're going to have the gentrification and the displacement, and you remove so much that makes Houston what it is.
And you got to do the hard work of really protecting neighborhoods through a set of policies that really show you value. And so when we create policies, we articulate a value for something and an investment in something. And we can't be a city. We love to say we are this city where the economy is always moving and functioning. You can't let the market decide everything. everything, right? Because the market doesn't have value for people. And I think if we're going to do this work, we're going to have to reorient ourselves. And I think part of it is really an old way of thinking. I always say Houston is like the teenager that went through puberty and had a lot of bumps and acne and, had not developed, and was always hoping someone asked them for a dance at the, at the party, right? But we've matured, we've blossomed. And so we don't have to take the first caller, the first person that wants to come and date us. We can be more selective and we can be more thoughtful. And so until we really start planning our communities, planning for what we want cultural diversity. We want a place where people from multiple income levels can live in the neighborhood. We want people's needs to be met. And that requires some planning and some thought. And so when you're instant and you're responding to the market, you can't create that intentionality. You talked about places that have intentional communities. That requires a mindfulness. And I think Houston has never been a city that wanted to do planning. It's never been a city that was willing to do policies. And if it's going to survive and neighborhoods are going to survive, it's going to have to really adapt to the current set of challenges. I think people in communities have adapted. And so now it's time for our leadership to adapt if we're going to have a Houston that really recognizes and celebrates the diversity that we think we celebrate, and that is our hallmark.
Yeah.
I think the thing that's also interesting about this whole thing, getting back to these statues, is whether or not statues should be replaced with statues, whether or not there are other kinds of ways that we can remember things.
Yeah. I love this gazebo.
Yeah,
I love this because it's a statue functional. I'm not really into things that are not functional, right? Yeah. So maybe it's a splash pad.
It's a green space, a pollinator, an urban farm.
This flower, something that gives life. Yes. So I love this question because that was a different way of recognition. Does that represent everybody? What does a statue do for people? And I think making spaces more functional.
When you're ready to retire, when you're sitting on the porch in the East End and sitting on the porch in 3rd Ward
on Holman Street,
what is the thing that you hope to look out and see? I'll go with you, Assata, first.
I hope to, and I know I will see Emancipation Avenue. I know and I hope to see the row houses who were built by people of African descent on West African architecture. I hope to see African Americans. There's this art project that started in Pittsburgh that says Black people are in the future, right? So I hope to see Black people in the future. And I work towards that each and every day. And I hope to see, even if my eyesight fails me, I hope to see the heartbeat of a neighborhood that's full with life and vibrancy, right? Because what we see is not just with our eyes, but it's with all of our senses, the smells, right? Yeah. Someone barbecuing, right? Smoking a brisket. I hope to see a bike rolling down the street, right, with an amplified sound, right? Yes. I hope to see young people walk into that park with their swimsuits and towels because they're going to EP to hang out or play basketball or do yoga in the park. So I hope to see the markers of the resiliency of African American history and culture that has given my life meaning and deep purpose.
What is it that you hope to see, Juliet?
I hope to see so much of what Assata described in terms of making sure that the culture and history is still there. Martini's Hardware or the Zacatecas or the Fiesta or the different parks, just hoping that some remnant of what used to be Gulf Gate also stays as a hub, a connector. That was one great thing that I loved about the East End, that it was close enough to downtown but far enough to be a connector to 610, which used to be the outside boonies of the city of Houston. But I also hope that the air is cleaner. And I hope that the smell that we sometimes smell in the morning is gone, because I hope environmental justice takes that our leaders have a greater calling to make sure that the environment is safer for our children as well. And I hope that it is green and that there are opportunities for the families to be able to enjoy what used to be Pecan Park, but, seeing the old golf course and the old historic trees. I hope that the beauty of what I've been able to experience in my life in that space for the people, the residents, but also for the animals and the plants and the creatures in the community too.
I think as long as we have people who continue to come back and live in the neighborhoods that they grew up in, like the two of you, this future that you imagine is the future that we'll see. I'm Melanie Price, and this is ICU. What impact does gentrification have on urban spaces? Our conversation with Assata Richards continues after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to ICU on Houston Public Media. I'm Melanie Price, filling in for Eddie Robinson. We've been talking about how the physical spaces in a city can tell us about how race works. My guest today is Assata Richards. She is a director of the Sankofa Research Institute. It's impossible, Assata, to talk about the racial landscape of cities without talking about gentrification. In many ways, gentrification is a nice word for neighborhood or community displacement. And so I think part of how we start to value neighborhoods has a lot to do with who values neighborhoods. As a resident of Third Ward, how has the gentrification impacted the community you grew up in?
I often think of or describe gentrification in the context of what we know as flooding and a disaster, in the sense that it has the ability, and in the landscape of Houston, which has a low regulatory paradigm, which means we don't have policies that really protect place. And of course, we know we don't have zoning, but then we don't have other alternatives to zoning that really give us a strong protection for place. And so we don't have any means of protecting historic structures other than markers. And so the same way you feel disoriented when there is a flood and you see the things that you love and the things you value being washed away, or the wildfires in California and other places, and you see them sweeping through and eradicating the markers which give you a connection to place, is what gentrification is. And it's a very unnerving process in the pace that it happens here in Houston. You can drive by a street and there can be a structure there that you have seen your whole life, that you've marked your comings and goings, that you've identified the loved ones, the friends, the events in your life that happen in proximity to that structure. And the next day, it can be gone with no notice. And what that feels like, the researchers call it root shock. That your roots are shocked. So think about a plant and how a plant is uprooted. And so we think about people being uprooted, but institutions and markers are uprooted. And the feeling of disorientation that is associated with that. And really the feeling of powerlessness is a part of that. And I often say the difference for neighborhoods where working class people live there is really those public spaces that you share, because your individual ownings are limited. Your structure is limited. Your house, maybe a small row house, but you share the park. You share that school where you went. You share the neighborhood store, or you share where the taxi cab company was on Emancipation Avenue, formerly Dowling. And so to lose that is losing a loved one. It is some of the most heartbreaking experiences that I have ever lived through. It's the feeling that the thing that has anchored me, which has been my neighborhood and place, is being shifted and taken from underneath me. And I am feeling disoriented, trying to find my way and relocate my compass.
I'm Melanie Price. This is ICU. We're speaking with scholar and community organizer Assata Richards. So how is that connected to race, though, right?
It's
Communities change, people move in and out of them. I've lived in multiple communities in the city, but how is that connected? How does race change the nature of gentrification?
Race changes the nature because, and I'm glad you asked that question, because gentrification isn't about race.
Mm-hmm.
Gentrification is about class.
Mm-hmm.
But in the United States, class is connected to race. So those who are the most economically marginalized and vulnerable are African American and Latinx. And so we often talk about third ward, but when you look at the national statistics, second ward is tops the statistics of displacement, right? And so because, and I am a person of African descent, I'm a third generation resident, and my grandparents came from East Texas into the historic third ward. We are a people who have historically been marginalized and have lacked the collective power to protect our bodies, ownership of ourselves, as well as ownership and a way of rooting ourselves in place. And that's why gentrification is a racial issue, because the individuals who are most vulnerable, who lack the resources to protect the places they love, have historically been people of African descent, Latinx, and of course, indigenous people. So in this society, race codes everything. And when you talk about gentrification, it also codes gentrification. And it's a class issue. So within the heterogeneous category of African American, you have a lot of different people, right? Mm-hmm. And so even in a place like Third Ward, where it's not all about a shift in the racial composition, which is there, it's also a shift in the class composition.
I'm glad you mentioned that, right? Because that's the thing that's really interesting, because one of the things that we know is that gentrifying can be done by people of any race. That is, part of it is about when you come into a neighborhood and change it so much that the people who are already there can no longer afford to stay. But sometimes the things that come with gentrification are the things that any neighborhood would have wanted even before the gentrifiers came, right? And so is there a way to be a positive gentrifier? Or is the term so latent for you with the negative associations of displacement? Like, can you make a community bring the kinds of investments that come with gentrification without forcing residents out?
I think what you're talking about is redevelopment. You're not talking about gentrification. Gentrification is associated with displacement. Right? And so there could be a case of people are voluntarily displacing themselves, saying, this neighborhood is changing. Okay, good riddance. I've had enough. I want to go someplace else. But when you have involuntary displacement, then you cannot make that a positive. Now, I think the interesting thing is really about these assets and amenities that we talk about, right? So when a neighborhood shifts, so I love, and I can just tell you that I left Houston and went to Penn State in Pennsylvania to go to graduate school. But when I would come back through the city and I would ride through the streets of South Park, Sunnyside, Third Ward, my very being would ease and relax. The very places, the tire store, the chicken spot, the barbecue spot, the places, the hair shop, the places that marked and created access to cultural tools that were a part of my life were important. Now, the problem or the challenges with the class issue is that what our preferences are oftentimes based on our income and our education. So what we like. And so there's the HEB versus the Fiesta. Right. So people will say, of course we deserve a shiny new HEB. A HEB that does not have a service center. You cannot buy stamps, money order, pay your bills. You can't get quarters for the laundromat. And so again, I think we lace a preference and a set of judgments on what's better, right? So we have to be very careful to assume that because we like shopping at the HEB or the Central Market or the Whole Foods, that other people value those experiences because they can get all their needs met. In working class neighborhoods, you will notice something that you won't notice in other neighborhoods, which is based by race. You'll see a tire repair shop, right? Why? Because working class people can't afford to go to the place where you get 4 new new tires with a warranty because they don't have access to those resources. So even in a neighborhood about amenities, many times in a neighborhood that's shifting in its demographics, it's about excess and not necessity.
Not necessity.
Right? And so making sure that when we think about what a neighborhood deserves, that people have created many times the resources and the assets in the neighborhood that allow them to survive and to have a quality of life that still has a value. The laundromat,
right.
You know, everybody doesn't have a wash and dryer in their home. I don't have a wash and dryer in my home. So going to the public laundromat where I'm able to see my neighbors is a benefit. And so I enjoyed the laundromat where someone else would say, well, we should turn that into a tea spot. I like tea, but I need to wash my clothes, right?
So that's the thing that you're always trying to juggle, right, in most urban landscapes. One of the things that is so puzzling in many Black neighborhoods is that many of them were taken over after white flight from the cities, right? So when people moved to the suburbs in the 1950s and 60s, when we were pushed towards integration, then Black people moved into these communities and they turned them into these places that have historic and cultural value to them. And now they feel like they're being pushed out to the suburbs where those people came from so they can take them back over in the city, right? And so it's this notion that basically Black people are allowed to live wherever white people don't want to live at the time. Right.
And I would even, Tupac had a saying, make $1 out of 15 cents. African Americans have made beautiful neighborhoods off of things that were left and relegated to them. So it's not that we just occupied the spaces. We made the spaces historic. We made them cultural centers, right? We made them offerings of arts and culture and food and commerce, right? I think, one, it's important to understand that even with the migration of African Americans, we're moving to integrate and be with other people. Their intention, even in Third Ward, was to move into a neighborhood where they felt they had some solidarity with the Jewish community for a shared history. And the decision of others to leave was not provoked or requested by African Americans. So I think that's an issue of justice. And so we came to be with people and ended being by ourselves. And I think for me, the most tragic piece of the way in which place is remade is that these neighborhoods were left to the least, the last, and oftentimes the forgotten who did stay and remain. And so I think it's very ironic that the children of those who left are now coming back to occupy and many times hijack a place without a real awareness of that history and that sensitivity to that history. And so it feels very unnerving and very tragic because we know the story and how hard my grandparents worked to buy a house, how hard they worked. And I think the issue of place, when Emancipation Avenue was going to be renamed and we went before the city hearings, the planning commission, people actually said, don't change this name because the value of my property will be negatively impacted. And I said, you're so right. Because when they hear emancipation, they will know it's a Black neighborhood. And your house will be appraised.
It's like when you live on Martin Luther King.
That's right. And that is the truth. And that's the tragedy, right?
Right.
So I think when you say, what I think may be the opportunity in this narrative is that now people of means, white and Black, will share a set of challenges that working class people have had to live with all along, right? Not getting enough trash picked up, right? Not getting enough maintenance in the public spaces, right? So I think what now can happen is that now that you move into this place and maybe from afar you said, those people just don't care. They don't take care of their things. And then you live in this place and then you realize the structural barriers to getting the resources you need to maintain your place, right? So I think that's the opportunity that now we can say, you are here, we're here. How do we make a place that acknowledges our history and culture, but allows us to build upon that as we move into the future? I intentionally live in an African-American neighborhood. I have lived in places for many years of my life where I felt alienated.
Mm-hmm.
I did not feel seen. I did not feel valued.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to pay that price.
Mm-hmm.
I simply don't want to pay that price. I don't want to pay it in my body. I don't want to pay it in my mind. And I don't want to pay it in my spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I often tell people that I deserve the right to feel comfortable. The Irish say a soft place to stand on the day when my feet are sore.
Mm-hmm.
I deserve that right. And so I think I am not interested in creating heterogeneity at the cost of my own safety and security. And see, that has been the problem. So the question is, will non-African Americans or Latinx or non-African Americans, will they be willing to be the uncomfortable one in the neighborhood? Will they be willing to be the one that cannot have all of the cultural offerings that they need? They need to travel a little bit further to get to a salon.
Right.
They need to travel a little bit further to get the makeup that they need, right?
Because I think that's really the question, right?
Yes.
It's not about that you come into the neighborhood. It's that you come into the neighborhood because it has these kinds of things that you treasure, and then you immediately start to turn it into a neighborhood you came from, right? And so the question is, can you live in the place that you found?
Can you appreciate and value
the place that you found?
If we can live heterogeneously, they see, and I think until we take away the greatest asset being your house, when you think of a house as only an investment, then this becomes hard. I don't think of my home as an investment. I think of it as my safe place to stand on the day my feet are sore. I think about what it gives me spiritually, emotionally. That is the value of where I live, not how much wealth it gives me. I just don't measure my wealth and my assets in that way. And until we are willing to do that, and that's hard in a market-driven city.
Yeah.
That's really hard.
It's been so great talking to you. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts and your dreams about a harmonious racial future, an inclusive racial future with us. This has been a great conversation. I can't thank you enough for joining me today, Assata.
Thank you for the invitation. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I've been happy to think about these memories of my childhood, but also of my future. So thank you.
That's it for this week. On the next ICU, as hip-hop turns 50, how do artists stay connected to the culture and community? From Big Pimpin' to politics, we'll find out how award-winning Houston rapper Bun B and others become grown and trill. That's next week, right here on ICU. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Our show team includes technical director Todd Hulslander, producers and editors Matthew Bura, Mark DeClaudio, and Laura Burks, and sound designer Dave McDermott. You can hear all our episodes online and subscribe to the podcast at ISEE show.org. I'm Melanie Price, filling in for Eddie Robinson. Thank you so much for listening.